Thank you and good evening. My name is Philip Knight, and as I was already mentioned, I am the Secretary of the Kernlight Gardens Residents Association. The association was formed 21 years ago to protect the suburb's features at the time of the transfer of control from the Garden Suburb Commission, which had been in existence since 1920, when the control was transferred to the Mitcham Council. My interest is not an academic one. We've heard a number of comments tonight about PhDs and others. I'm not doing a course like that, although my neighbour and one of your members is. Rather, my interest arises from a respect for the outstanding efforts of the planner of Kernlight Gardens, Charles Reade, who really involved the public in the decision-making on how and where people are to live. In the great Australian tradition of suburbia, he was very interested in. I believe that his passion and persistence stands in quite a stark contrast to today's modern town planning methods, where professionals have taken over, and rather than the heady days of the 1920s. In 1989, the Kernlight Gardens Conservation Study was published, and the study recommended that the entire suburb should be nominated for inclusion on the Register of the National Estate, and that nomination was made by Mitcham Council in December 1993. The study also recommended the entire suburb be nominated for inclusion on the State Heritage Register, and that nomination was a joint effort between Mitcham Council and the Kernlight Gardens Residents Association in October 1994. The nomination was made after a substantial community consultation program was conducted jointly by Mitcham Council and the Kernlight Gardens Residents Association. We produced an information brochure, and I've left some copies up on the back table if you're interested. The community response, as described by council staff, was outstanding, with an overwhelming support for proceeding with the State Heritage Area listing. And again, that was a remarkable achievement. We involved the community at large, every household in that community, held a number of meetings, and again, I think it was the most successful way of having history be alive. So, a lot of people say, well, what's so special about Kernlight Gardens? I'd even argue that the name is purposeful. The Colonel Light was to recognise the achievements, of course, of Colonel William Light. Charles Reade had pushed for a number of years for the suburb to be called William Light Gardens in respect of William Light. The Gardens lies in the English Garden City Town planning movement. Many other suburbs came later, included gardens in their names, and unfortunately I regard that as being a little difficult because they don't have the Garden City element in them. The State Cabinet was the one who approved the name of Kernlight Gardens in April 1921. In a 1991 judgment of the South Australian Planning Appeals Tribunal, Judge Reade wrote, "The zone has a special place in South Australia, and even world planning history. Kernlight Gardens has a significant heritage input, being the first major garden suburb development to be tackled in South Australia." Alan Hutchings, a commissioner in the Environment, Resource and Development Court, wrote in the International Journal Planning History, "This garden suburb, increasingly recognised internationally as perhaps one of the gems of the garden suburb era, has survived almost intact in its plan form, landscape, the location and quality of its community and recreation facilities, and the maintenance of its 1920s Californian bungalows." Dr. Robert Freestone wrote his PhD thesis on garden suburbs in Australia. He's now a senior lecturer with the School of Town Planning at the University of New South Wales. Recently wrote that both Reade's plan and the three-dimensional form of the suburb as built served to make Kernlight Gardens one of the most interesting, if not outstanding, model suburban developments of its time, both in a domestic and international sense. We regard that these are high tributes to the historic merits of Kernlight Gardens. It's unfortunate most people can't spell the word Colonel. It's amazing. The origins of Kernlight Gardens go back 100 years to industrialised Britain. The hardships of the working class slums had inspired some industrialists to provide for planned communities for their employees and their families. The Lever Brothers' Port Sunlight and Cadbury's Bourneville provided clear examples of the reform possible. Ebenezer Howard planned for new communities which would combine industry and healthy living environments by careful town planning. His Garden Cities of Tomorrow set out his ideas. Fingers crossed. This was supposed to be all rehearsed. That is a diagram out of Howard's works. What he was doing was establishing small population centres surrounded by a larger rural type atmosphere. It was connected by canals, railway lines and roads, but essentially as each of those communities reached its maximum potential of around 30,000 people, you then move to the next one and the next one. So each size of each of those small towns was able to have close access to a rural type environment. And that was in stark contrast to industrialised Liverpool and others. A number of other developments followed in Britain, including London's Hampstead Gardens. In Australia we had Sydney's Appian Way and Haberfield, which both incorporated aspects of these new planning concepts. By 1910, a New Zealand journalist, Charles Reade, Charles Reade had travelled to Britain and inspected the industrial slums and these planned new communities. Reade wrote a series of rather passionate articles for Australasian newspapers on the lessons to be learned from Britain's slums. The articles were reprinted in his book, The Revelation of Britain. Reade also wrote of the need for an Australasian town planning lecture tour to be directed at the general public. Reade returned to Britain and took up the position as Secretary of the Garden Cities and Town Planning Association and also edited its journal. In 1912, an architect, Raymond Unwin, had written a paper, Nothing to be Gained by Overcrowding. This work was aimed primarily at real estate developers to show them that they could profit out of developing these new concepts. Both of them are working in different directions, I'm afraid. Here we go. This is Raymond Unwin's idea. That was the standard gridiron pattern. You had the houses fronting onto the streets, standard format. This system here had, for the streets around, the houses all back onto a reserve. We had children's playgrounds, we had tennis courts, and we had bowling greens. We also had some of the houses set back from the corners to allow better visibility for traffic. The houses were set back here to avoid a monotonous building line. And again, it was a different concept. His planning and costings were able to show that there was a profit in it for real estate developers to market this style of concept while providing a better community. Unwin also had proposed to have a radial entranceway linking in to the suburbs. And again, it was a nice formal entranceway, and we'll see that as a recurring theme for Reade's efforts in Australia. That's working. In 1914, Reade embarked on a public lecture tour of Australia. The general public had already been introduced to modern town planning as a result of the publicity surrounding the national capital design. 80 years ago, and we heard earlier talk about celebrating anniversaries, it was 80 years ago, last October, that Charles Reade generated enormous publicity for his lecture tour by referring to slums of each capital. He referred to these slums of Adelaide, and our city fathers, primarily property owners, weren't terribly happy with such comments. They emphatically denied the charge. Reade, the true journalist, and generated enormous amount of publicity despite World War I going on. He was able to generate that publicity. And he responded with some well-researched photos. There we go. The top shots. This is out of the Critic, late 1914. Top shots are some of the ones of Adelaide. And again, he repeated this theme throughout as he went to each of the capitals. The backyards, the back laneways, the wasted space and huge wide open roads. He contrasted that to some of the town planning which was available from England. Again, he filled lecture halls right around Australia and delivered over 100 lectures. By educating the public, he had placed town planning on the political agenda. Within months of the end of the lecture tour, the South Australian government had appointed Reade to advise on town planning matters. The government had also purchased Grange Farm from the Mortlock family to develop a model garden suburb. Unfortunately, at the same time as the government was purchasing it, World War I was well and truly operating, and the army needed some new space for an army camp. So the best site was Grange Farm. So we had the army here, yes. We had the army that came on the site, and they occupied the site until the end of 1920. So Reade's plan to put and design the settlement was somewhat stalled. Also in 1916, Reade's General Town Planning Bill was defeated in the Conservative Upper House. Undaunted, Reade returned to educating the public, his main thrust. As Australia's first government town planner, he co-organised Australia's first town planning and housing conference and exhibition. That 1917 conference attracted 250 delegates from throughout the Commonwealth and was held in the Institute building on North Terrace. Reade unveiled his plans for Adelaide to delegates with comprehensive town planning. That's out of Parliamentary Paper number 63 of 1919, but that was first shown at that conference. What he proposed was as I said, a comprehensive system of town planning. He had a second ring of parklands encircling the city. We hear that come up from time to time. He had, along the River Torrens, he had proposed that be an area reserved for public or other purposes. Some later time we've now have ended up with the Torrens Linear Park. But that was his plan back in 1917. Unwin's radial entrance is clearly seen on a grand scale over at West Beach. And the garden suburb was marked out. The haphazard development in 1917 contrasted heavily with Light's core plan. Reade displayed also at that time his plans for what was then referred to as the Mitcham Garden Suburb, and he used it to give the delegates a practical view of garden suburb town planning principles. A plaque to commemorate that conference was placed on the statue Light's vision. Reade also designed a number of other children's playgrounds and other work throughout the state. The second town planning housing conference was held in Brisbane in 1918. Reade delivered major papers on the importance of proper town planning. Henry Barwell, the then Attorney General and Minister in control of town planning, delivered a paper which explained the design elements Reade had used in his Mitcham Garden suburb. The design had as main features the main circus entrances, Unwin's radial entranceway again, and another circus entrance at the far corner. The central square with churches and institutes, the administrative centre of the suburb, two shopping centres, this one called Bond Street, that one called the Strand. You can play Monopoly well. We've got other ones around, but Piccadilly Circus is one of the circuses. So again, it was all tightly controlled. The design also had roads of varying widths to direct and concentrate the flow of traffic along the routes specifically designed for their use. So we have, that was called the main internal highway throughout the suburb. We'd now call it a collector road. All the other roads are much more minor in their construction, narrower in their width. The idea was, why waste all the space on roads when you could have that as parks and gardens or backyards? The street corners were obviously rounded for better visibility, and this was stated quite clearly in the speech, when cars were not travelling at the speed they do now. And the distance between each house was to be controlled. Some houses were set back to avoid the monotony. Examples of that still exist today. Utility ways were provided running almost parallel to each of the roads, and they were straight for sewerage, electricity, gas, and for the most direct pedestrian routes. And again, I quote, "The provision is also made for placing in these ways gas mains, telephone cables or poles, etc. The objective again is economy and also the preservation of the appearance of the street as well as the foliage and growth of its trees. Our electricity still goes down the back laneways. They were not there for night carts. Our suburb was sewered from the start." So again, those utility ways are straight and the roads could then have the nice artistic curves in them. Public buildings were placed to form terminal vistas and included schools, aged persons' homes, etc. And again, we had a hostel, a theatre, a town hall and the institute, and each way you looked you had a major public building at that terminal vista. Nothing was by accident. We also had internal reserves were provided throughout the suburb, and they were provided to allow people of smaller means, lesser means, to be able to purchase the smaller blocks of land which abutted those and be able to live in the same general precinct as people who could afford the bigger blocks of land. These blocks generally here are 120 foot deep, whereas the bigger blocks nearby can run up to 170 foot deep. So again, you had people without social segregation throughout the suburb. Robert Freestone, his PhD thesis, used a 1921 quote to explain what a garden suburb was. The term garden suburb or garden city is constantly used in reference to town planning. Just what the term means is, however, somewhat difficult to define. The special characteristics which differentiate them from the ordinary town or suburb are the allocation of special quarters or sites for each kind of building, the absence of congestion of dwellings and their better arrangement, the ample provision of parks, playgrounds and open spaces, the planting with trees and grass of the part of the width of the roads where not required for traffic, and the provision of greater opportunities for social intercourse. Freestone went on to identify the features of a garden suburb. He said it should be a separate community, it should have plenty of open public space, have internal reserves, land use zoning, roads being classified and forming a functional hierarchy. Curves were there for artistic beauty. I dwell on that point. There's a lot of people who seem to get lost in Colonel Lake Gardens. They curse the curves, we love them. Curvilinear symmetrical design and not being a gridiron pattern. It should have single family detached dwellings at low density. Ample yard space front and back. Front gardens were to be a showcase. It should be a thing of beauty. There should be no jarring note. And trees, shrubs, lawns, private and public gardens would emerge into a park-like environment. And lastly, he said there should be private home ownership. All those features Reade had incorporated into this design. The enabling legislation, the Garden Suburb Act, was passed in late 1920, as was the Town Planning Act. Reade had left Adelaide at that time to work in the Federated States of Malay, interestingly William Light's birthplace. Unfortunately, Reade shot himself in 1933. The first release of the blocks took place in late 1921 in the northern end of the suburb. That's some of the existing eucalypti. The gentleman in the photo was the engineer for the suburb and later to become a very long-term garden suburb commissioner. But the suburb was built as it is now. It wasn't the subsequent subdividing of blocks and then further re-subdividing, which typifies most of the suburbs. Again, one of the private homes, the obligatory gravel around in the circular garden. These are the shots again out of the state records, the town planning files. And the people that were in these photos, and these were the houses where the people came from to become what is the other important feature of Colonel Lake Gardens, and that's the 1,000 Homes scheme. To remedy this problem, the government had the southern area redesigned. Those are the two slides. This being the original design, with nice formal parklands here. This is the new design. Pretty much the same street layout. A lot of the internal reserves at the southern part of the suburb had been taken out, and the blocks were almost a uniform 150 by 50 foot size. Whereas the mixture of sizes which Reade originally planned for a variety of socio-economic groups to be included had somewhat got lost. As a consequence, the smaller blocks which would have otherwise appeared in the southern end of the suburb are all universally of quite a substantial size, 50 by 150. But again, the same street layout remained. Also, it was we had the new portion of the western side of Colonel Lake Gardens purchased. Right, this was to the western side of Goodwood Road. It confuses a lot of people. We have two sides, an east and the west. The western side was two farms had been purchased, and that block was excluded. It was the original farmhouse. It still stands there today. That was always remain in the District Council of Mitcham, surrounded by the garden suburb of Colonel Lake Gardens, surrounded by the District Council of Mitcham. We had confusion over who repairs the roads, the footpaths. The other thing of note, those blocks along Goodwood Road were never part of the original sale. The foundations had already been poured for developments along there, and then now CD hire shop and dentists and others. But that's also not part of Colonel Lake Gardens, which confuses people now in, even confuses those businesses. They think they're in Colonel Lake Gardens. They're not. The design of the western section obviously has more to do with the maximising number of blocks rather than following the garden suburb principles. And in all, 695 of the 1,000 homes were built in the southern and then the new western extension to the suburb. There were some 15 designs to choose from, and the houses of identical design were not permitted to be built on adjoining allotments. One of the plans for the State Bank homes, one bedroom in that case, we had, I think there was the highest was either 11 or 13 children went into homes of this size. Priority was given to large families. Of course, and again, it was fitted within the garden suburb philosophy of having harmony but not monotony. Coneway Gardens developed in an interesting way. The blocks in the northern part of the suburb were still to sell in great numbers. There was problems with transport and electricity and others. However, the 1,000 home scheme was built at a fairly astonishing rate. The junior primary school building was built to take the vast number of children coming into the area, although the main two-storey building had yet been completed. The main oval for Mortlock Park, the rather substantial school, one of the biggest schools of its time, quite clearly evident, and the existing gum trees. The Strand didn't really take off as well as it could. There was some competition from Goodwood Road. The suburb was designed very much in mind for the tram to run down Goodwood Road, and again it was very much a feature of the suburb as Reade had designed, and in his the Parliamentary Paper number 63 of 1919 is even his drawings for the tram to come down. It was a way of getting people into the city. Again, Mortlock Park surrounded by the homes, rather pleasant sight, although the trees are somewhat small by today's standards. Again, roads were tended to discourage the through traffic throughout the suburb, and again it causes some problems with people in the suburb today. One of the main routes that people use, unfortunately, is East Parkway. I live on East Parkway. Bus still runs there today as it did then. However, we can see that the road, instead of coming straight down, has a series of bends in it, and the purpose of that again was to discourage through traffic, but to avoid the rather long and monotonous street was to have bends in the road and with things of artistic beauty. As you looked up this way and you saw a garden plot, as you look down this way, originally there was a church on this side. So again, the whole suburb was designed around the terminal vistas. One of the artistic light poles which we had in the suburb, the rather mature gentlemen around now, as young boys, said they used to enjoy breaking the glass light fittings on top. They didn't last terribly long. We'd like to see those put back in again. Our heritage advisors are trying to get some good quotes on that. Sporting clubs certainly played a great deal of a great role in the suburb. We had many sporting clubs throughout the suburb, both in the formal areas of Reade Park, where this one is, which was an informal name given by the people to differentiate themselves from the 1,000 home scheme area. So we had those formal areas, plus we also had informal areas of the internal reserves, which were taken over by the local surrounding houses and developed as local tennis courts, and many still serve that role today. Croquet again was a feature, and tennis for the Reade Park Tennis Club. Coneway Gardens Primary School, very little has changed for that. My two sons go there at the moment. It's booming in its population. They've had to add extra rooms onto the portable extensions because the suburb is regenerating with lots of new people coming in. So they consider to be at their peak, and expansion has required these extra accommodation. However, there are only half the number of children there that were there when the suburb was initially established. There's some 900 students there. The existing gum trees, which led to the old farmhouse, again still in very good condition. Note the informality we have of our curbing and guttering in some of the areas. Conservation study recommended that remain as is. This is East Parkway. The rules were that you could have the same tree until the road curved, and if the road had a bend in it, then you could replace that with a different tree. But again, you couldn't interplant along the way with trees of a different species. And again, Coneway Gardens shows some excellent examples of that. Not all streets were designed to be planted with trees. Many of the secondary streets weren't considered wide enough to house trees in them, and so we have a bit of a mixture in some of those streets. The old bandstand has been rebuilt on Light Place. It was opened by Dame Room Mitchell last year. That's 1949, and that's 1993, I think it was. Again, there's very little change. There's very little subdivision that's ever taken place at these blocks, unlikely to be any in the future. And but again, those pattern of houses have stayed remarkably consistent over that period of time. And that's what we're aiming to keep. And again, to keep the community very much involved in its heritage and why we are so different to adjoining suburbs. I'd just like to take this opportunity to recognise that Mitcham Council did supply a $300 grant for the copying of the old photos to make these slides, and I'd like that recognised. I quite often bag Mitcham Council on some events and noted in the paper for doing so, but again, credit where credit's due, and they've been extremely responsive from a heritage point of view. And thank you very much.
Thank you, Philip. And I can think of nobody more appropriate than our new Vice President, Hamish Angus, to move a vote of thanks to our Speaker tonight.
I think it would be fair to say that Philip has a passion for Colonel-like Gardens. I have had the privilege of being taken around Colonel-like Gardens by Philip in December last year with the State Heritage Authority on the day that they considered it for the becoming a State Heritage Area, which fortunately they supported, and it is now in the process of coming into reality. It's a slow process and it will be some time before it actually does. But when it does, it will be recognised as a very important part of the heritage of this state and of this country and of perhaps the world because of its important role in the garden suburb design. So I'd like to thank Philip very much for his enthusiasm for Colonel-like Gardens. It really is largely as a result of his enthusiasm that it's going to become a State Heritage Area, and I think that's credit where credit is due. And I would like to ask you to thank him in the usual manner.